Welcome to another edition of Coexist. It is Conversation for Conservation. I'm your host, Co Lewis, and I'm very excited today because we've got another spectacular guest who's going to be joining us talking about how we can save the world and how we can improve the planet and the choices we make and the things we do. And before we get to my special guest, Dr. Joanna Grossman, I was driving in here and I was kind of thinking about the podcast and the concept of the podcast and why I did this. And it was not to be, famous, none of that. A lot of people go and, I was in radio for 35 years and it was always about ratings, and that was fine. But when I went into this podcast, the ratings to me are if we get one person who's impacted by what we say and what we talk about and what we're committed to changing, that to me are the greatest ratings in the universe. And, I have had the pleasure over the past few months of talking and meeting some of the most amazing people who've done so much on this planet. These are the humble heroes out there that every day they're out there slugging away, trying to impact the world, to affect change. It's not a glamorous job. It's difficult. It's heartbreaking. But in my book, these people are absolute heroes. And that is the whole impetus and the whole precipice of the show, is to give great organizations and great people a platform. And I would be honored not only if you listened to it or watched the video, but please share it with your friends, because like I said, it can be one person who can absolutely change something dramatically. We're all trying to undo the damage on this planet, and we're running out of time in so many ways. So what do? We pull together with great ideas and we start doing things that are going to have a positive impact on the globe. And I'm very excited because, as I mentioned earlier, my special guest today is Dr. Joanna Grossman. And again, I feel really not qualified, doctor, because I'm looking at your background. Fulbright Scholar from Oxford, doctorate from Harvard, stuff from Princeton. I mean, you have achieved great things in academics, but what you did was you took everything that you've learned in your experiences and you have landed at the Animal Welfare Institute. You have been a federal policy advisor. You lead the equine unit for AWI. You're a lobbyist for AWI. Your work has been featured in or on The Hill, Newsweek, NBC News, and so much more. So I'm so excited to have you here and so excited to share the message of Animal Welfare Institute, your work with the equine unit, and all the things. And I'll start with this. I hear the Bureau of Land Management and I go insane. I don't know why. So we're going to be getting into talking about that and the equine issues that that we want to make sure the public are aware of. But first things first, why don't you tell us about the Animal Welfare Institute? I didn't realize it's been around since 1951.
Yes, a long time. And thank you, Co, for that lovely introduction and for the amazing work that you do to raise awareness about animals and your work in Africa to combat poaching. I just want to say, I think what you said is completely spot on. I mean, if the pandemic has shown us anything, it's that our treatment of animals truly matters. And if we're going to save humanity, it starts, I think, with compassion towards any and all species out there. But yes, regarding AWI, the Animal Welfare Institute, yes, we are one of the nation's oldest animal protection groups, founded in 1951, like you said. And we cover sort of the whole gamut, the whole spectrum of animal protection issues. We help companion animals, farm animals, wildlife, of course, equines, domestic and wild, marine, you name it. We have somebody who's working on that issue. And a lot of what we do is we try to affect change through legislative advocacy, regulatory work, litigation, campaigns, of course, advocacy, humane education, instilling those sorts of values in young children so that the world can hopefully be a better place as a result of that. And AWI as a whole, I mean, we've been involved in, I would say, virtually all of the landmark legislation over the past 50 or 60 years when it comes to animal protection. A lot of the early landmark bills like the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act, of course, the Animal Welfare Act, all of those things. That's something that AWI has been involved with, lobbying legislators to ensure that there are better laws that are able to protect animals. That's certainly a lot of what we do. And as you mentioned, I'm a lobbyist, so certainly talking to a lot of congressional offices on a whole host of issues that we cover. But yes, we certainly do a lot of that on the Hill because we think that, frankly, in the US, there needs to be stronger laws when it comes to protecting animals and ensuring that those are on the books and the ones that we have are enforced properly.
I really wish that our foundation, like you said, is, we've got offices here, but we're based in Zambia. I sure wish we had a lobbyist or somebody fighting for us, in the policy making in laws, because that's a really important tool to have. If you're an organization, you can do all the great things and the things that are necessary, but if you're not changing the laws and you're not changing policy, it's pushing a boulder up a hill. You know what I mean? And one day maybe Nsefu will grow up big enough in Zambia to where we can actually go to the government and say, hey, we've observed this. We'd like to share the information that we've got. Can we change this? So having the lobby angle is really amazing. So how did you and AWI come together?
Well, as you mentioned, given my background, I initially thought I wanted to be in academia, but my heart was always with animal protection, and I wanted to do something that I felt was more practical. So, no offense to academics, what they do is wonderful too, but my heart is with animal protection, and I wanted, like I said, to be doing something where every day I could be, writing something that would reach people directly and hopefully prompt them to take change or to take some kind of action that we're asking. And of course, like I said, meeting with congressional offices. So I really like sort of the more fast-paced nature of it because, as you well know, there's no shortage of animal protetion issues that need people to be working on them. It's everything.
Like they're
really
growing. It almost seems like they're growing because of is it due to overpopulation and the encroachment issue and the need to feed the population that why does it seem like it's so much more magnified now than when I was a kid? It feels like it's everywhere, these issues.
I think you're right. Overpopulation probably does play a big role in it. I mean, there's also just a lot more awareness nowadays too, of course. So that works to our advantage. But yeah, I think in general, people are just a lot more aware, and social media helps to spread the message. But yes, I mean, for sure, I think that our treatment of the environment has led to a lot of conflicts. We see that with wild horses, of course, but with all manner of wildlife. So that certainly, I think you're right, is a big part of it.
Yeah. And, when the impetus of why we were talking is because I get your emails and stuff like that. And, I always look for guests and organizations that I admire and I respect. And then when I talked to Marjorie over there and I heard who I was going to get, I'm like, oh my God, yay, this is going to be huge. I love it because I am inspired. What I've learned about this show is every show that I do, like sometimes I find myself like having to put my jaw back up because my jaw drops because I've learned something or I had no idea that something was going on. And I'm like, so this is a great way for somebody who might be in their car listening. Maybe you're at home, you're doing some house cleaning or whatever, and you want to find purpose in your life and be inspired. And this is where you can do it with somebody like Dr. Grossman, who, could have stayed, like you said, in academia, but she decided I have more important work to do on this planet and I need to get out there and to impact change. So congratulations to AWI for surviving this long. How has COVID impacted your fundraising, et cetera? Because I know it has hammered our foundation. How is AWI doing right now?
I think we've been weathering the storm okay. I don't think there's been like a tremendous dip, and that's partly because I should sort of plug our organization. I mean, we are a very highly rated charity. So we get 4 stars on Charity Navigator. I think it's 99.9 out of 100 is our score. I know a lot of publications, periodicals have rated us as one of the best animal charities, if not the best, to give to. So I think people know that they can really trust us, we spend virtually none of our money on fundraising. I mean, it really goes towards our programmatic work.
Good.
Right. So I think that in that sense, we have not seen, like falling off a cliff or anything like that in terms of our donations. And we just, I know, had a very successful Giving Tuesday campaign, which I think you'll appreciate this given some of the work that you do, geared towards our humane education work, giving books on sort of the treatment of animals to kids in underserved communities, which I think, especially right now because of the pandemic and a lot of students obviously being displaced, is really important to make sure that they have good lessons plans, good books available to them, and again, sort of geared specifically towards fostering values in terms of how we treat animals. So that was our Giving Tuesday campaign, making sure that some of the books that we publish that are geared towards children, we're getting to kids in underserved communities.
That's really important, and I applaud that education angle. That was something that my co-founder Victory Wallace and I said at the very get-go when we started NSF. It was, if we don't reach the children, they're the upcoming generation who will be the stewards of their country and of their animals and of the environment. If we don't teach them what's going on and make them aware of what's happening and create an environment of compassion versus seeing animals as beasts of burden or a food source, but looking at them differently, and how the health of their wildlife can really support the health of their country. That's excellent that you guys have done that. So congratulations on having such a high rating. Only 99.9%. Come on, guys, work on the 100%.
100% might have been too suspicious.
You can do it. So let's get to why you're here, because I look at the US and I always think to myself, we should be the flag bearers, the torch bearers of doing things right. We have the means, we have people who are passionate, we have amazing resources, and the stuff that we're doing to our own animals and our own wildlife and factory farming, I'm shaking my head right now, because we sure are not living up to what we could be as a society. And it's always been a really sensitive issue with me with the wild horse and burro situation in America. I mean, this is the icon of America. This is the free, fast-running Mustang that represents the spirit of America. And the whole issue that we've got going on with horse roundups, trying to get these animals off land, there was an issue of some of them going to slaughter. I mean, this whole thing, how we're treating these animals, especially, this is an issue primarily in the West, the American West. Tell us what is going on right now with our wild horses and burros. What is going on with the Bureau of Land Management, which makes me want to scream? What's the status of these animals overall in all areas, and the area that you specifically want to talk to about the ones in Utah, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
And thank you, Co. That was a really wonderful synopsis for any listeners of what's going on. So yes, the Bureau of Land Management, which is part of the Department of Interior, manages the vast majority of wild horses in this country. Not all, but the vast majority. And these are federally protected animals. I mean, like you said, Co, these are icons, symbols of our nation's heritage, and they're federally protected through the 1971 Wild Free Roaming Horses Burros Act, which, among other things, it charges the BLM with managing them humanely, preventing their harassment and death. But the BLM has fallen, I would say, far short of that measure. And what we're going to talk about today, earlier when you alluded to certain things being jaw-dropping, I think this is one of those things.
Yeah.
Anytime I bring this up, people are really shocked. But what's going on today is that for the past few years, the BLM, in an effort to curb population growth, because keep in mind the BLM thinks that there are too many wild horses out there on the range, they want to reduce the numbers. So in an effort to curb population growth, the BLM is proposing to surgically sterilize wild horses. And more specifically, what they are trying to do quite aggressively is employ a method known as ovaryectomy via Copotomy on wild mares. And this is, as the name suggests, the manual sort of removal of the ovaries of horses. So, we can get into, I suppose I should give an explanation of how the procedure works, although
Yeah, because people need to know that this is actually happening.
yeah, and it's gruesome and certainly not difficult to it's difficult to hear about, but like you said, it's important. So with ovaryectomies, the way this works is um, a veterinarian inserts his or her arm through the vaginal incision into the abdominal cavity with a metal rod, which is known as an écrasure or an écrasure, however you want to pronounce it. And this procedure, you'll hear it referred to as a blind procedure because you can't visualize the organ. So by touch alone, they try to locate the ovaries and then they sever and crush them and remove them. And this is done while the animal is conscious, alert. It's regarded as an outdated procedure. It's not something that I think any veterinarian is just going to do willy-nilly. But the reason that the BLM wants to do this is, like I said, to curb population growth, but it comes with a lot of significant risks, such as evisceration, hemorrhaging, infection, pain. Of course, it requires significant postoperative care, and death. Death is a risk as well. So, so it's a serious business what they're trying to undertake. And
so hang on 1 second. I'm sorry, I didn't know we lived in the Middle Ages because this sounds like something that they would put on like heretics or something like that, like something crazy like this. What's the most pain we can inflict in a short amount of time? Whatever happens afterwards, apps on you. Wow, this is in 2020. Yeah, it's a crap year, but we're in 2020 and we should not even, this shouldn't even be something that would be even contemplated. Okay. Right. Again, this is where I won't hold back. The Bureau of Land Management, the stuff I've observed over the years, I am absolutely incredulous about how these people run their departments. I'm always suspect of the people who are running the departments because you never know who they're allied with, cattle people, ranchers, farmers. You never quite know where they're coming from until you see what they, put out as law or what they're going to pass. So I want to back up quickly because I want to throw out a couple of numbers because then I want you to go back to what you're saying about this crazy surgical procedure. I'm sorry, torture, I mean.
Yeah.
So the BLM spends, they have like a budget of like $50 million a year.
It's actually much higher than that. Their wild horse and burro program budget, it's at least 100 million, I think, with the
100 million.
At least. I mean, with the appropriations are being negotiated, but it's going to be quite a bit higher than that even.
Right. Okay. And we're talking for how many total horses?
Well, right now there's an estimated 80 to 90,000 horses on the range by their own estimates.
Okay. So we're spending that amount of money corralling them, helicopters, rounding them up, sending them off to, different places, getting them adopted out. We're spending all this money per horse.
Yeah. So it's about 60 million, I believe, what they spend on what you're referring to. So the rounding up through helicopters, the holding costs. So yes, it's a very significant portion of their budget that goes just to that aspect alone of the work that they do to be managing horses.
Yeah. Doesn't that sound just completely wrong in off in every way?
I think everybody, regardless of the side that they're on, even the livestock industry would probably agree that's a huge waste of taxpayer dollars. It doesn't make sense to do that.
Yes, and I don't understand why do they feel compelled to have them in specific areas, where they live their life out in corrals and in these facilities? What about the designated land that they're allowed to be on? Why are they not allowed to just be on there? Why are they always being rounded up and sent off somewhere? What am I missing there?
Well, that's the $1 million question. I think the short answer is there is a lot of pressure on the BLM to remove horses because they are viewed as competing for grazing with cattle. So there is a lot of pressure from ranchers, from the cattle industry, to remove horses. They're regarded as competition, like I said. But you're absolutely right. There is absolutely land that's been designated for them, these herd management areas where they're supposed to live and be managed. But the BLM sets what they call appropriate management levels. So they determine what they think is the population that the land can support. These are oftentimes pretty low populations. In the herd we're going to be talking about in Utah, for example, right now there's an estimated, I think, 550 horses. They want the AML, the appropriate management level, to be about 70. And for 290,000 acres of land, that's not a lot of horses. And it's also questionable, a herd of like 70, from a genetic viability standpoint, doesn't make a lot of sense either. So, these AMLs, the National Academy of Sciences has already told the BLM point blank how they arrive at these determinations is very opaque and not necessarily grounded in any kind of scientific reasoning. So, like I said, the short answer to your question is I think there's just a lot of pressure to remove wild horses because the land can be used for other extractive purposes and industries and for cattle, like I said.
Is AWI showing the cattle industry, everybody is now finally realizing the impact of cattle on the damage of to earth, the water resource, the water that's consumed by, cattle, the
Soil erosion,
land, the methane. I mean, these animals, I mean, I love cows, but we have too many and we have an industry that's out of whack right now. There is no balance in this industry. So now that, they're coming in trying to crash on this federal law on these wild horses and burros, they're putting pressure on. They shouldn't be even talking to anybody about this. They are protected. End of story. If you guys want to come up with another way, but it seems like the BLM is completely in over their head. They don't even know how to manage these horses. I think I could manage these horses better on $20. Then I'm not.
Yeah, you probably could. It only costs $30 a dose for PZP, the immunocontraceptive vaccine that all of the animal protection groups support. This is a humane way to manage horses and has been used successfully in a lot of herds already. But to date, the BLM has refused to implement it. They spend less than 1% of their budget on fertility control. And again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, they're spending, whatever, 60 million or something on rounding up and storing horses. They're in over their heads, like you said. I think that they started down this path because they said, well, the easiest way to quickly remove a horse is, of course, just round them up via helicopter and just put them away. Rather than take a more proactive and long-term approach, such as managing them with immunocontraceptive vaccines, like I said. And for any listeners who have not seen, what a roundup entails, I would definitely urge them to look at videos and images. It's quite brutal. Horses die during these roundups. They're being chased by helicopters. You'll see foals not able to catch up with the rest of their herds. It's very, very sad.
Yeah, it's awful, and that's why I hate to come out sounding like I'm anti-BLM, but you know what? I am. And I think any American who pays taxes, if they knew how this money is being wasted, especially with the icon, like I said, the spirit of America, it's not like we have an overpopulation of these horses. There's designated land. They're allowed to live their life unharassed and free from anything, especially impact of people. And this is so poorly run. I just really want to scream right now. So we'll get back to the whole horse issue first, but let's go back to the crisis that's happening with this Utah herd. And where does it stand right now? Is this going to happen? Are we still in a place where we can stop what they want to do with this Middle Ages torture chamber?
The good news is, yes, we're still in a position where it can be stopped. The bad news is that the roundup is actually currently occurring as we're speaking. And as I said, so this is the Confusion Herd Management Area in Utah. The roundup is going on right now. I believe it ends, in a couple days. And some horses have already died, including from a fractured neck, a broken neck from, running into a panel, that sort of thing, from other injuries. So the roundup is occurring as we speak. And the BLM, they have not been very clear or transparent about when they would start to surgically sterilize these horses using the ovaryectomy method. It probably wouldn't be for a little while, namely because they don't want to perform them on pregnant mares. And a little bit of backstory on that is that when the BLM first proposed doing this as part of the experiments that they had proposed in Oregon a few years ago, part of the experiments, in addition to quantifying the incidence of mortality and morbidity in horses, was also to quantify the incidence of abortions, of aborted fetuses. And they got a lot of backlash for that, even from Republican lawmakers in Congress. Like I think Senator Mike Lee was questioning this and criticizing this. So people, thought that was very troubling and, again, a gruesome aspect of the experiments, that they were going to do this on pregnant mares. They were going to quantify the incidence of aborted fetuses. So the BLM, I think, got significant backlash for that. So they've walked that back, and they say they're not going to perform them on pregnant mares now. So they need to, wait to see, test to see which ones are pregnant, check on that, and of course, wait for them to give birth. So that's going to delay it a little bit, since a lot of the mares that come off the range are likely to be pregnant. So that's where things stand currently. There's still time to stop it. There absolutely is. One of the things that AWI has been heavily involved with and spearheading is the effort to get lawmakers in Congress to condemn the BLM for what they're doing. We just had 58 members of Congress, both parties, come out and criticize the BLM and ask them to refrain from doing this. And I think that it's possible we might be able to get a legislative fix through, for example, appropriations language. These are the spending bills that Congress passes annually. And they include provisions on what an agency can or cannot spend their money on, for example. So if Congress directs the BLM not to use funding to do this, then they're not able to do so legally. So that's, one avenue, for example. I think organizations are, of course, weighing their legal options. Needless to say, we were involved in the previous lawsuit, as I mentioned, when the BLM tried to pursue this in Oregon, on a herd in Oregon. And we were successful in securing a preliminary injunction to stop the BLM from ovaryectomizing those mares. So, we're in a different situation now. This is in the 10th Circuit, whereas that was in the 9th Circuit, and the precedent was a lot more favorable. And the BLM has sort of shifted gears to try to create a new sort of strategy, because as I said before, they were initially proposing to study this as part of a research project. And they were trying to do it with, first, I believe, with Oregon State University and then with Colorado State University to study ovaryectomies on wild horses, because this is an untested, unproven method to be using on horses to study them. And both OSU and CSU backed out. And then the BLM, rather than try to seek another credible academic institution with expertise in equine welfare, decided they were going to try to do this on their own, basically without public observation, without any kind of independent, meaningful observation to see what was going on, because they probably don't want the public to see what's happening. But then, like I said, we were able to secure a preliminary injunction in 2018 to stop them there. But now they're circumventing the experimental route altogether and just trying to integrate it directly into their management plan for this particular Utah herd. So that's where we're at now. But fortunately, like I said, I think members of Congress are a lot more aware of the issue now than they were previously. This is
all I can say is we need to follow the dollar here. We need to follow the dollar to see why the BLM feels so compelled to be doing these kinds of practices. An extreme amount of money that is just the most obscene waste of money that I can even fathom right now. Somebody's just got to follow the dollar trail, because there are evil forces around this, like you said, cattlemen, farmers, whatever. But I think that people really need to be made aware of, not only is it just intrinsically wrong what's happening with these animals, but the absolute, this is like the bloated government. Like, it's so fat and there's so much money that nobody knows what one hand is doing. It's like, oh, I didn't know you were spending 200 million over here. Oh, we have 2 trillion. Nobody cares. No, there's no accountability. And I really think that it's time for the BLM to just be completely disassembled and rebuilt from ground up, because this is a failing, archaic institute that is not managing anything well, and they sure aren't managing money well, because whoever's charging them, I'm sure the helicopters are saying, oh, it's a government bill, so we're going to round that up 5 times what we would normally do, because it's the government paying it. They don't care. It's taxpayer money. Oh, they don't know what's going on. Yeah. So does AWI get into that kind of do they tackle this issue from that angle? Like not only just being lobbying and stuff like that and trying to inflict, do they have like another division that kind of looks at the big picture, like what's wrong here? There's something wrong here and we need to tackle this to fix this. Is AWI able to do that?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly put out a number of publications and research looking at, like you said, sort of the holistic big picture of the landscape, so quite literally in this case, and what we're dealing with wild horses. And um, certainly the data shows, for example, that if the BLM were to take a, like I said, proactive approach um, with using immunocontraceptive vaccines, they could start to manage horses effectively on the range. And that would ultimately keep their costs down. I'm not saying it would be an easy undertaking by any means, but that would ultimately have long-term savings because you wouldn't have to be resorting to, like you said, very expensive helicopter roundups, which cost a fortune, and it costs a fortune to certainly keep these horses for a lifetime in holding. That's a ridiculous waste of taxpayer money. So yes, we're certainly pushing the agency directly, pushing lawmakers in turn to direct the agency to do this because a lot of their direction does come from Congress in terms of how they manage this. But the BLM, it has been sort of like dealing with a brick wall to some extent. They've been very reticent to change, and it's been incredibly frustrating. They started down this path, decades ago, and it has sort of spiraled out of control from their perspective. I think what the BLM would say is they're pursuing methods like this because they want to have every tool possibly available to them, even though in this case, welfare concerns aside, it's not practical. You're not going to be able to ovaryectomize enough mares or find enough veterinarians even willing to do this. So it's not practical. But they are certainly under a lot of pressure. There's a group you may be familiar with known as Protect the Harvest, which is one of those sort of an anti-animal group. It was founded by Forrest Lucas, or Lucas Forrest. I always forget the oil tycoon's name, but he founded that group. So they sort of represent ranching interests, and they've been pushing the BLM very hard to implement ovaryectomies for wild horses.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of pressure.
Wow, who knew?
Yeah.
Who knew? And that's the thing is when you expose people, like I was not familiar with it, but now I'm familiar with it, and our viewers and listeners are now aware of this guy trying to pull this kind of stuff because all he cares about is the dollar and his industry and doesn't care about anybody else. Again, this is our country and the whole world. We're moving parts that are supposed to be working together. And I get it. That's easy to say versus actually doing. But I think once you identify the cancer in the body, you get rid of the cancer and start fresh. And when you start seeing groups like this who are leaning on a government agency, I don't think that's right. I don't think they really have the right to do that. Might be able to talk to them, but if you're able to lean hard enough to sway and go against federal law, there's something wrong there. That whole angle is wrong. And so let me ask you this. So horses that are rounded up, for our listeners who aren't familiar with this, they're rounded up. Where are they taken and what happens to these horses?
Yeah, that's a great question. So immediately once they're rounded up, they're put into short-term holding. So that's going to be, usually a corral that's on site. Needless to say, they're packed in tightly. There can be fighting, conflicts, and injuries. Eventually those horses are transported to long-term holding facilities, and what that means is sort of a euphemism or a fancy term for essentially they're put sort of on pasture basically, and the government will typically pay individuals who own the land a certain sum to basically just keep these horses on pasture. They're segregated by sex. They're not going to be living in natural herds or family bands anymore. Obviously the stallions are going to be gelded, that sort of thing, and then they just sort of live out their days there. So that's basically what happens to them. They're sort of taken off their natural habitats, off the range, put into pasture. So moving them to other geographic parts of the country to do that. And it's obviously the animals are not being necessarily tortured by being put into long-term holding, but it doesn't make sense to do this. It's obviously inhibiting their abilities to live as wild and free animals. They're not, necessarily living the life that they were meant to have anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. They're kind of having their own COVID moment where they're quarantined in an area and that's it. And that's all they're going to
That's
get.
it. And some of them are going to be adopted or sold by the BLM. They try very hard, the agency, to do that. That opens up its own can of worms. There have been, unfortunately, notorious instances where, as you mentioned, I think at the top of the show, some horses have ended up in slaughter, being sent into the slaughter pipeline. I think another thing that Americans are not aware of, but they're shocked when they hear about it, is a lot of our horses are actually sent abroad to be killed for food. Now, wild horses, that's not supposed to happen because, A, they're federally protected, and B, there's appropriations language to prevent their destruction for commercial purposes, but they slip through the cracks. And if a horse is being sold for bargain bin prices, which sometimes happens, the Forest Service right now, actually, so they manage some wild horses as well, has been selling horses for $1 a piece. So you can imagine the incentive that might create for what are known as kill buyers. Those are the individuals that make a profit by getting horses, and they can truck them across the border to Canada or Mexico, where they are ultimately slaughtered and killed for food. But a lot of horses end up with that fate. It's about, I mean, the numbers have sort of fortunately declined a bit over the years, but it's still tens of thousands of horses, mostly domestic, of course, who are being killed for food. And I think a lot of Americans don't realize the fate of so many horses in this country.
And there are planes going to Japan filled with horses as well. I mean, this is a real thing. And unfortunately, with this show is sometimes you have to pull the curtain back and it's really ugly behind it. But if we didn't make you aware of it, then change wouldn't happen. I wish we could say it was all horses lived out like in a fairy tale book, but they really don't. And we know from the racing industry, and we know from this.
Yeah, I think about 10,000 thoroughbreds from the racing industry end up in a lot more than people realize. And I would also just add, it's not like a humane death by any means. Because of the physiology of equines, when they're put in these environments, they're of course panicked. I mean, these are typically domestic animals. They're panicked, they're thrashing their necks about wildly. They're not usually able to be stunned or rendered unconscious on the first try. Back when horse slaughter facilities operated in the US, which was many years ago, USDA was documenting instances where you have eyeballs hanging from a thread, just really horrific things like that. And like I said, the animal's not actually conscious prior to being killed. So, obviously, I don't necessarily think there's any humane way to kill an animal, but especially with horses in particular, it presents a whole host of problems you're not necessarily going to see with other species.
Yeah. And people, it's hard to hear, but people need to know this goes on. And this is, and just to go back, not to, keep going over it, but something you said that just kind of encapsulated everything we've talked about. So they're rounding up horses to take them into corrals and then ship them off to like pastures. Wait a second. They've already got their own land. Why are we now having to pay somebody to keep horses when they've got their own designated land? I get maybe trying to keep the herd at a manageable population with your vaccine, the vaccination, to make sure that pregnancy, not every animal is getting pregnant every, season.
Yeah, it's a never-ending cycle. Yeah.
This is the absurdity of this. I'm incredulous, and I knew I was just going to be all fired up when I did the show, and I am fired up about this. This is just insanity and absurdity of fat government.
Well, and to play devil's advocate, I mean, so that people are sort of aware. I mean, what the BLM would say is that they have to do this because they believe that there's just too much environmental degradation, and as a result of the horses, and they refer to the carrying capacity of the land. So that's what they'll say in their defense. But it's really worth pointing out that the BLM will never, ever look at the livestock impacts, for example, of all of the sheep that are grazing, or any of the extractive industries, whether it's mining, oil, gas, etc. Somehow it's always the wild horses, and acting director Pendley, or I forget what his title is right now, because
Director William Perry Pendley.
Yeah, a federal court ruled recently that he's serving illegally as head of the agency, but he point blank has referred to wild horses as sort of the existential threat that's hurting our lands out west, and that's really just absurd. I mean, their cattle so far outnumber wild horses. And wild horses, by their nature, they're not going to be sort of sedentary, just trampling the ground over and over again. And like I said, just the sheer numbers objectively paint a very different story.
Yeah. And if somebody is the director of that program and they're coming out with that line, that person should not be in that job, because obviously they just have a grudge and they're on the take, or they're getting pressure from somebody, because that is not
It's a
prudent.
very, yeah, no, you raise a good point. It's a very biased view, considering
Yeah.
this is the agency charged, like I said, under the 1971 law to protect these horses. And if
Yeah.
that's what you're saying, then right, I mean, it's already clear what your position is.
Yeah, and unfortunately, what makes me mad is that we created this law and nobody seems to be following it. Nobody seems to be enforcing it and backing it up for what it really is. And like you said, the BLM is interpreting what this area should have and what should happen over here. And how many states have wild horses? Actually, I don't think I actually know.
Know this off the top of my head. I'm so bad with numbers. I mean, it's virtually every Western state that has them.
Mhm.
So I want to say like 10.
10.
I'm very bad with numbers. I usually forget what year it is even.
Oh, no
But
worries, no worries. I just wondered if it was like just a few states, or a few horses in every state in the West. That
no,
makes
I think
sense.
pretty much all of the Western states, I believe, have populations. And just so listeners know, there are also a few wild horse herds on the East Coast as well. There's some very famous ones in North Carolina, for
That's right.
example. Yeah, Maryland, Virginia border area as well. And it's worth noting those herds are actually managed successfully with PZP, with the immunocontraceptive vaccine that I referred to. They've been managed very successfully and safely and kept at a stable level. They are not managed by the BLM, not surprisingly. I mean, like the BLM, like I said, um, has been averse to implementing PZP on their own herds, but certainly there are herds that are managed very successfully with PZP, and the ones in North Carolina um, and Assateague, for example, up in Maryland, Virginia area are managed with PZP.
So if somebody took that to the lawmakers and said, "Hey, these herds are being managed for a fraction of the price. They're being managed very well." Mind you, the government agency called the Bureau of Land Management does not want to do that. In fact, they want to have $100 million annual budget for these horses and the roundups and the care, and trucking them to pastures where they're paying people to keep them. How are the lawmakers not saying, "Wait, whoa, 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 BLM, do what they're doing at a fraction of the cost," because the bottom line is the lawmakers, their bosses are the taxpayers, and they need to listen to the will of the taxpayers. So how do we get that across
Well,
more?
thank you for raising that point. That's actually very salient right now, because the fiscal year 2021 appropriations package is currently being negotiated. And I'm pleased to report that um, there was actually a historic vote over the summer for an amendment to the bill that would, and it passed overwhelmingly by voice vote, that would direct the BLM to spend a minimum of $11 million on PZP fertility control.
Oh,
So that was wonderful to see. I know, hooray! But it's still being negotiated. And just to make the quick little plug, but if listeners want to contact their lawmakers directly about this issue, they can by going to our website, awionline.org. Right at the top, it says "Take Action," and you can find this particular issue and many others where you can contact your lawmakers directly and tell them you want to see that language maintained in the final spending bill that's currently being negotiated. So this is really important. This is historic, like I said, that this amendment passed, and it would direct the BLM to spend, roughly 10% of their budget on PZP. So that's an important first step if we can get them to at least do that, because, like I said, right
wow.
now they're spending virtually 0% on fertility control. And as we know, given the ovaryectomies, the methods they are pursuing in terms of fertility control are suspect at best and very inhumane and brutal at worst. So it's important that lawmakers do hear from their constituents on this issue. There's a real opportunity right now on the table to actually start to implement some positive change in that direction. Because I think Congress, part of the reason that amendment passed is I think lawmakers are getting very, very frustrated with the BLM, realizing that without clear directives in place, they're just kind of spinning their wheels. The status quo is going to continue, and the status quo is completely untenable. Um, so we were very happy to support that effort and lobby legislators on that issue. Um, is like I said, lawmakers are quite frustrated with the BLM. A few months ago, the BLM issued their report and proposal to Congress about what their strategy is for the next 5, 10, 15 years for wild horse management. And it was appalling, the report that they submitted to Congress.
Good.
It called for accelerated mass roundup, so even more in terms of removing horses. It called for, like I said, using surgical sterilizations. And I think the BLM admitted that in the first 5 years alone, it was going to cost, I want to say, $900 million to implement their plan. So it really was just like their current
I
MO
hope
on
the
steroids.
lawmakers just are like, are we being punked with your plan? Like serious?
Yeah.
Like, are we being punked on this? Because this is crazy.
It's crazy.
And you know what? And if the BLM gets their act together and they streamline and they make better decisions and they are more open to all species and all situations, people will be more apt to support them and not want to have people throttle them like I want to throttle them daily and you must live it. But if they're making moves, like if the approved money to do the PZP is done, well, that's a good start. But somebody needs to just look at that budget and say, you guys are out of your minds. You're crazy. This is the $600 toilet seat with the Pentagon. You know, the famous situation with the Pentagon and the $600. It's all over the place here. You know, so. I think that's amazing. What else are you guys working on right now with horses other than this particular issue? What other areas are you working on right now?
Well, like I said, at AWI, we cover any and all horse issues. So domestic horses are a big part of the work that we do as well. And I touched upon already the issue of horse slaughter. That's a campaign that the Animal Welfare Institute initiated many years ago to end the slaughter of horses for human consumption. We've had success in the sense that horse slaughter facilities no longer operate here in the US domestically, whereas they used to, but we still have the problem of horses being exported abroad, like I said, tens of thousands each year. So we're hoping for passage of the Safeguard American Food Exports Act, the SAFE Act, which would ban the export of American horses abroad. And that includes wild horses as well. So no horses could be transported for slaughter. It has a tremendous amount of support in Congress. It's been tough to get any kind of standalone bill to pass. There tends to be a lot of gridlock. I'm cautiously optimistic in the sense that both President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris have been longtime supporters of this issue. So hopefully that can give us sort of the final nudge that we need to get this done. But there really isn't any vocal opposition anymore, whereas there used to be years ago. So some people were kind of defending horse slaughter as an industry. But really there is sort of no defense for it. So there really isn't any opposition anymore. So hopefully we can finally get this done and essentially close down the slaughter pipeline that a lot of horses do fall victim to. Another issue that we're working on, again, hoping to get it to the finish line, we are behind a bill called the Horse Transportation Safety Act. That refers to is the use of double-deck trailers to transport horses. And double-deck trailers, these are livestock trailers that are designed for actually much shorter livestock animals, so cattle, sheep, hogs, etc. But it is surprisingly legal in a lot of states to put horses in these conditions. And keep in mind, as the name implies, double-deck trailers, these are 2 levels. The horses cannot actually comfortably stand inside. So it poses a risk to other drivers on the road. There have been cases where these vehicles have tipped over. The horses themselves obviously are at risk of suffering injury. There was a horrific accident in Illinois that prompted this legislation in the first place, where I believe 59 horses were being transported in a double-deck trailer. It turned over on a highway. A lot of them died. So this did actually pass the House over the summer as part of the Transportation and Infrastructure Package. Now that has apparently stalled this session of Congress. But again, I think that we're optimistic that it's very close to reaching the finish line now. Again, another sort of very common sense issue. You would think, I think people are surprised, like, really, it's legal to put horses in those conditions? I mean, it's a public safety risk as well. And it's also just about closing a particular loophole, because years ago, USDA actually banned the use of double-deck trailers to transport horses to slaughter, recognizing the serious welfare risks that they posed. So it's something that's deemed too unsafe for slaughter-bound horses, but not too unsafe for other horses. So again, it's about closing that loophole. It's certainly a safety issue, a welfare issue as well. We're optimistic that that has very good chances of reaching the finish line, like I said. And there's, like I said, there's no shortage of horse issues out there, both wild and domestic.
I
So
mean,
those
but
are
you've
just a
got some
couple.
victories. You've got some positive stuff happening and some victories. And, yeah, and we were talking about, is the animal abuse and the poor welfare of animals, is it escalating, or is it because we're more aware? It's kind of twofold. And what it seems like, it just seems like, I sometimes feel like we're moving forward, where I see real progress in compassion and the treatment of animals. And then a couple of instances will set me right back, like, oh, wow, how did that happen? You know what I mean? And I always ask every guest this, and I'm going to ask you. So, looking over, let's say, the past 10 years, are we getting better? Are the lives and health of animals, and in your case, since you're in the equine unit, horses, is it improving or stable or getting worse? Where do we stand right now with all the information that's been put out there in the public and people are made aware of situations? Where do you see the status of horses and their welfare?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I think to some extent the answer probably does differ a little bit species by species and sort of the
Mhm.
area that you're talking about. I mean, on the whole, I think I am cautiously optimistic that we're seeing some improvements, largely just because of a lot more public awareness, and social media, I think, has done wonders for spreading news very quickly when there's cases of abuse and mistreatment. But I think sort of the more, I guess, cautionary answer would be more, I think, stable over the past 10 years. With horses in particular, it's tricky because they're not necessarily afforded the same protections, for example, that a cat and dog would be, for example. So they are by and large, at least in terms of domestic horses, treated as sort of in the same category as livestock. And as you know, on a state by state basis, needless to say, livestock are not afforded a great deal of protections
Yeah.
under the law. So
Yeah.
in that sense, we certainly hear of a lot of cases of abuse and neglect. But then again, in our line of work, of course, you're going to hear
Yeah.
about those cases.
Yeah.
So I don't necessarily, it certainly hasn't gotten worse, but I think, you're sort of looking at a stable to slightly better situation. But I think the trajectory on the whole is very positive, precisely because back in the day, members of Congress, for example, they didn't really necessarily take animal protection issues all that seriously. And now every congressional office has a staffer who's dedicated to handling that portfolio. And they, will fully admit this is probably the issue they hear from constituents the most about. So it's very gradual and slow progress, especially in the legislative sphere, but frankly, just in general when it comes to animal protection. But I think we continue to see, positive advances. We continue to see things heading in a good direction. So I would say, I think the lives of animals are, like I said, cautiously, I would say I am optimistic that it's gotten better, but not as much as we'd like to see, that's for
Yeah,
sure.
and improving as fast as we'd like. And maybe in this COVID world, we're realizing, and I think a lot of people are aware now of the impact of zoonotic disease. When you keep animals in stressful,
Yeah,
unhygienic situations,
right.
they're carriers, how easily it's transmitted. Um, I think factory farming is going to be in for a rude awakening. I think there's another pandemic lying in there somewhere because of just the mass
Yeah,
death going on and disease going on.
right.
Something's
You've,
going to happen there.
you've
And
probably
it's
seen
just
the
a matter of
articles
time.
about the, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to, you
Oh, no
probably
worries.
news articles about the fur farming industry and the mink that contracted
Mhm.
a novel strain of COVID. So yes, factory farming and fur farming. Whenever you cram, this horrific number of animals in those conditions and those numbers, yes, it's absolutely a breeding ground for zoonotic disease,
Yeah.
and we're
Yeah.
already seeing it. I mean, the next pandemic is unfortunately potentially just waiting to happen,
Yeah.
unless we get our act together on
That's right.
how we treat animals.
And we have lost our way again with animals. I mean, we're this whole thing, the factory farming. This is something that is dangerous beyond words. Just even removing the whole issue about the animal and the animal's life and their pain. Just taking that equation out of it, we're asking for it with factory farming. It is going to happen. It's just going to happen. It just is a petri dish ready to just launch one way or the other. So you're right. And I think COVID has really made people aware of how fragile our lives are and how entwined we are. And when we encroach too much in the wild world, the blowback is going to be big. And here we are 9 months later, feeling the blowback of COVID.
I mean, some months ago, I think it was Dr. Fauci who said something like, I don't know what more needs to happen for people to realize that this sort of bizarre and unnatural interface that we have with the natural world is not sustainable. And he's just right when he said that. Whether it's exotic animals or in the case of factory farming, just raising domestic animals by the billions and cramming them into those conditions and dousing them with antibiotics, and then you have antibiotic resistance issues. And like you said, the greenhouse gas emissions, all of it. It's just it's mind-boggling. Yeah,
it's a disaster waiting to happen. It's just going to be a different one. It's not going to be coming out of an open air market somewhere. It's going to happen in factory farming, and so everybody just better get ready for it, because it's going to happen. It just can't help but happening. But again, Dr. Grossman, I'm so thrilled to have spent this hour with you. You are fabulous and you're fascinating. I learned so much, and I'm sure everybody watching and listening learned so much. Again, my jaw's been on the ground many times with everything you've been saying. But the one issue we want to highlight once again is the horse situation going on the wild herd in Utah, with this incredibly torturous Middle Ages type of sterilization process that they are wanting to undertake with these horses, which can lead to infection, to death, and God knows what else, going on.
And even though we're talking about this one herd in Oregon, I mean, it's worth noting the BLM intends to roll this out in other herds. So it's a question of stopping this, because they're not just going to limit it to these poor horses here. They want to basically have this as the new management approach for herds across the West. So it's very dangerous and very precedent setting what they're trying to do. Fingers crossed that under a new administration, with the new Secretary of Interior, I know some of the top contenders are Senator Udall and Congresswoman Haaland, who both have been outspoken in condemning the BLM for trying to do this. So maybe we can see some progress on that front, like you said, and sort of start from the ground up with the BLM and see some.
I'm on them. Oh, I'm so on them right now. They're going to be so sorry I have a podcast, because I'm on them. Trust me. So again, if somebody wants to learn more about your organization, they can go to awionline.org. And you said in the corner, there's a way to take action and talk to your whoever is in senator, House of Representatives, whatever, and take action and all the issues that you guys are working on. You don't deal with just wild horses, deal with the whole scope of the animal kingdom.
Yes, and they can take action specifically on this issue. So let lawmakers know about what the BLM is doing and how they're trying to ovaryectomize horses using a really inhumane and unsafe procedure.
Yeah. And it's time to make them accountable, because once people see what's going on, not only is it just against the law, but the abuse of spending money like drunken sailors. I'm sorry, there has to be accountability, and people need to know this is going on. And I'm really glad you shared that with us. And again, awionline.org is the website. They've been around since 1951. They've got a 99.9% grade. So they're almost 100. They're almost perfect. So thank you so much for dedicating your life for those with no voice. Thank you for your passion and your compassion and fighting the good fight for animals out there. I'm so honored that you're on this show, and share it with your friends, share it with AWI. Let's create some change. And there's somebody out there who's going to change the world here. Somebody's going to be listening, and they're going to go, that's what I want to do. And that's what I want to fix. So Dr. Grossman, a pleasure. I hope I get to have you back on, and we'll get an update on what's been going on with you guys, and any updates on the laws and that have passed and all that stuff. And thank you again for your time. Give my best to everybody at your organization.
Thank you for the work that you do as well.
Oh, it's my pleasure. My pleasure. It's absolute joy. Again, that's another edition of Coexist. It is Conversation for Conservation, and we can't do this without you. And hopefully you've been inspired. You've learned something new. And if you'd like to send me an email, you can at coe@nsefu.org. You can always reach out to Dr. Grossman. I'm sure she'd love to hear from you. But we appreciate your time, and we will talk to you in a few weeks. So have a great one. Thanks, Doctor.